Okay. So considering that we're here under the topic of innovation, there's a major onslaught that some of our colleagues are trying to make on the subject of innovation. It's basically the proposed demolition of the Vatmuller Center, and I urge all of you to join those who think that that is a bad idea. The proposal is essentially that if innovation doesn't lead to profit, it's not worth having. So we should, the proposal is that we remove the Vatmuller Center off the face of the earth, and whatever problems exist with the thing is so impossible for architects to resolve that the only possible thing to imagine is its demolition. Now, we object to this view of the imagination, and we think that the proposed demolition continues a long onslaught on the fabric of Claremont. As you know, it was a place with small streets and so on. Nobody knows this today because forced removal sorted out. So this is the last piece of the forced removals that they're trying to get done. We deeply object to this vision of the city, and we're asking you guys to resist. If you agree with us on this, you must please register as an interested and affected party. You can see the website there, vatmuller@ashleylilly.com. And then you must send your objection in by the 13th of December and tell other people about it. We cannot have this kind of a city. It's not just a place for big business. If I can move on to the business of the day. There was a guy who started working in our office. I basically described to him basically the things that we do and how it does. And I made this little diagram that then got the modest title of Theory of Everything. The theory of everything is not like life, the universe, and everything. It's not like that. It's basically everything that we do in our office and how it hangs together, because there's quite a bit of work between me and my wife that we are involved in. And this little diagram tried to work out what's the link between all of the stuff that we are pursuing. So if I can just run through the diagram very quickly, it concerns itself with the interactions between people and their environments. So the first thing is a link between people and other people and those social interactions that happen. The other link is a link with people and nature. And the third link is a link with people and the artifacts. Now by artifacts, I mean the city, the buildings, the things that we make, the things that we live around with. So the first connection, if we consider the interaction between people amongst each other, is the ethical dimension, things that we really should do. Constitutional culture is part of that, all sorts of issues relating to our ancestors, our children, all of those sorts of things are really important. The next issue is interrelationships between people that have no ethical dimension, and that I would describe as cultural. Things we choose, things we repeatedly do, the world of ideas, all of those sorts of things. So we're interested in that line of thinking. The next one is the relationship between people and their artifacts, and the one kind of link is with the material world, with technology, with materials, and I cannot divorce technology and materials from labor. I think it's an inextricable thing, and in our context, the thing of making a labor-absorbent economy, creating jobs, all of those sorts of things are intertwined in our relationship to the artifacts and the materials we use. The next dimension of artifacts is the negation of the material, and that is the spatial, where we consider how people live in space. It relates to that idea of Dalibor Vassili's, that what he calls situations, is that the basic building block of architecture is the situations that people construct. He gives the example of the French cafe as this classic human spatial situation, the way people sit in the building looking out at the street and so on. And he's arguing, and I agree with him, is that the spatial world that we inhabit is read and created through such spatial situations. The next link is the link between people and nature, and there, very simply, we have constructed nature, agriculture, gardens, those sorts of things that I have a huge interest in. And then the last one is, call it the natural world, the world as we find it, maybe the world that we would want to leave behind. So it's a basic kind of a link of interactions. The primary intrigue that we have in this are these interactions. And that is a field of study for us. It is the primary basis of this diagram. So in considering the interactions between people and other people, artifacts, and nature, what we are saying is that we got to understand is that these interactions pre-exist our arrival on the scene as architects or as an architect in a project or whatever. And that there's a huge obligation on our part to study the world that precedes us and to understand how that works. So my wife and I are involved in many different kinds of projects where we study the world around us in order to provide insight for future action. Now, the principal thing that architects think that they're involved is this suggestion of intervention. But of course, we got to understand that habitation pre-exists our interventions. So in the world of the interventions that architects enter into, there are a few dimensions that I think is worth considering. The first is that we can make temporary interventions that need not be permanent, or that we can have permanent interventions. Now, the nature of our interventions in the spatial world, in nature, in people's lives, take three kinds of action. The first kind of action is instrumental action. Now, I owe some debt of gratitude to Habermas and Adorno for this, but instrumental action, for all the warnings they give us, is that there's certain kind of instrumental actions that I will not apologize for. I do not consult anybody as to waterproofing buildings. I just go and I do it because I think that must be done and I don't care. I just do it. So, and the consequences of that is largely pleasant for most people. There are other kinds of instrumental actions that architects engage in that they do not ask people anything about, and that has the warnings that Adorno raised about instrumental action. This forum is too short for that. The next thing is a major field of action for us is that's communicative action. It means that the basis of my action comes through communication with others. I establish my motives through discussion, and that discussion then informs my action. The last one that Adorno and Habermas and those guys seem to be quite blank on is imaginative action. This idea that things come out of thin air for people like us is that we have all these discussions, we think all these things, and poops, there's something else. And it's not quite clear where that came from, but that our imaginative action, the measure of it is not whether it comes from our imaginations, but we test it. So we are professionals in what we do. So we might conjure up weird and wonderful things, but we test the applicability of the stuff of our imagination. And then the last thing in considering the interactions of people is to consider the consequences of our interventions. Now, that is really important. There are two dimensions primarily. The one is the future unfolding of our interventions, particularly in the context of the city, in the context of sustainability. The other one is relationships of power that's embedded in our actions. Now, whether you are conscious of it or not, but I think our interventions are seeded with power games or power relationships that we are very often the authors of, and I think it's important to be conscious of that. Now, I would argue is that architects in setting up or being involved in interventions in people's interactions, it's a kind of a setup, like a plot in a story that unfolds, a plot in a murder. There's kind of a thing that we set up something. Now, that setup means very little if it is not matched by an expression, because what differentiates architecture from the actions of other people who act in the built environment is this idea that we express what we do. We find appropriate expressions that has an independent, autonomous language that drives it. So I can give you four things that I think mean something within that kind of a expression. The first is the ontological and the mimetic. It sounds really big, but the ontological, in essence, referring to Kahn's idea of what does a brick want to be, or what does this institution wants to be, that the nature of the thing is expressed. So that's one kind of expression that you can have. And then the other side is the mimetic, Semper's idea that we annihilate material reality in order for symbolic content to emerge. There are two diametrically opposite poles that are alive at all times in architecture, whether you know it or not. And we basically choose to, for a particular project, to calibrate the expression between these two poles. The next one is the familiar and the strange, is that in studying a pre-existing pattern, say you're doing a French cafe, you might think that that pattern is really valuable and it's worth perpetuating, and you might perpetuate it as is and it becomes a very familiar expression. There's nothing wrong with that. Alternatively, you might think that this is a project where it needs a rupture of some sort, where the strangeness of something is really important for beauty to emerge, for sense of the new to emerge, and so on. The third of these sliding scales is that you can choose to make a big impact or no impact. Sometimes if you say build in a natural environment, you want to have no impact, or you want it to return to a situation of no impact, and so on. So big impact, no impact, there's no right or wrong on this, it's simply on the sliding scale. And then the last one, and I must thank my brother Adams, who's a professor in philosophy, for working with me on this diagram, is this, this idea of the intimate and the anonymous. Now in architecture, very often we are so concerned with intimate relationship, this very close, this wonderful little street and so on. But the anonymity that rests in the world is important. Like my brother would say, is that he has an anonymous relationship with a taxman and he would like to keep it like that. The postman has an anonymous relationship with his wife. It's cool. So the idea is that just like human relationships, interhuman relationships can be either anonymous or intimate, and that none of this is either right or wrong. So we make space where some things are incredibly intimate and powerful and some things are quite anonymous, and that we can judge in the making of this thing. Not everything has to be intimate and extraordinary. Some things can be much more anonymous.